Here's how it appears the coconut oil works. Insulin resistance prevents brain cells from accepting glucose, their primary fuel. Without it, the cells die. But there is an alternate fuel known as ketones, which cells easily accept. Ketones are metabolized in the liver after eating coconut oil. Insulin resistance doesn't just affect people who have Alzheimer's, but also folks with dementia, MS, diabetes, Parkinson's, ALS, even autism. So can coconut oil help these people too? It appears so, at least some of them. Then there's Butch Matchlin, an American living in Mexico City. He's suffered with ALS for almost 5 years and says his symptoms have reversed thanks to coconut oil.
Yeah, I can pick up, yeah. And there was a time when I had difficulty with that, okay? Not just picking it up, but it was just holding on, just getting a hold of it, okay? Getting my fingers to go around it, okay? And that's gone.
While Butch isn't walking perfectly, his legs are stronger and about to get even better.
I have bad knees, okay, from the past, okay? But now, okay, I've improved enough that the doctors have said that I qualify for a new knee in my left leg.
So while not everyone has experienced great results with coconut oil, there are plenty who have.
You say this gets into the liver and releases ketones?
Ketones, that's the key ingredient, because they're thinking that a lot of these diseases like Alzheimer's, dementia, Parkinson's, ALS, even maybe autism, that for some reason glucose, which is the primary fuel source, isn't getting into the brain cells. But ketones are an alternate fuel source, and that's what you get from eating coconut oil, but they're really not found anywhere else.
But now the glucose is just sugar, isn't it?
I mean, that's from regular food.
Regular food.
Yeah.
But the people with Alzheimer's, they don't process the glucose?
That's what the thinking is that glucose is not getting into their brain cells, and so the brain cells die. But ketones are a different kind of fuel, but the only place you can find them, coconut oil. You know what else? It's a natural antibacterial. And so it kills a lot of the bad bacteria in your body and frees up your immune system to fight viruses. It's actually been shown to fight herpes and AIDS viruses because your immune system isn't so busy fighting the bacteria. So you and Terry were earlier talking about colds and flus. It's a great natural prevention for colds and flu.
This 32-year-old man, he was dizzy, his hand was shaking, he had difficulty walking. This man had lost 60 pounds in the last year due to diarrhea. And these are the actual pictures from this 32-year-old man. You can see these big white blotches here, here, and even getting down into the brainstem a little bit. These are bad news. This is an active lesion or an active problem of his brain deteriorating at such a fast rate that they can actually find it on MRI, and it's showing up as these white spots. Initial diagnostic considerations were ALS and Friedreich ataxia, and if you're familiar at all with ALS, ALS is Lou Gehrig's disease. If you're diagnosed with Lou Gehrig's disease, your prognosis is to go home and get your life in order. Thankfully, the physician who saw this young man was sharp, and he or she did a lot of lab tests to rule out anything else he can, found all this negative things, and he finally did a duodenal biopsy, which means he went down into the intestine and took a sample of this kid's intestine. Comes back and says diagnosis biopsy yielded crypt hyperplastic villus atrophy with numerous intraepithelial lymphocytes, most consistent with gluten sensitivity and neuropathy. So here's this kid that they think has Lou Gehrig's disease. His doctor, thank heavens, was sharp enough to actually do a biopsy of his intestine to find that he had complete villus atrophy. This guy was sensitive to gluten. So the patient started a strict gluten-free diet with improvement of symptoms during the next several months. Repeat MRI imaging 2 years afterwards, and this is what they found. Remember those big white splotches? They're gone. So initially what they thought was Lou Gehrig's disease, which is go home, get your life in order. Guy stops eating gluten, the symptoms are gone. The findings on the MRI are gone. Makes you really wonder. Makes you wonder about Lou Gehrig himself. Did you know that Lou Gehrig was the first athlete to appear on the Wheaties box? And if you ever get a chance, you can read it now, or you can go on and search Lou Gehrig's final speech. It's a powerful speech, but it really makes you wonder, was this the case with Lou Gehrig? Did he have full-blown ALS that was caused by gluten sensitivity? It's cases like this that are not that uncommon. This is why I'm so adamant about not eating gluten, doing gluten-free diets. Once your gut's destroyed, it creates an inflammatory process in the brain, and the brain degenerates.
U.S. GM crops. Soy, 94%. Corn, 88%. Cotton, 93%. It's not a lot of crops. Soy, corn, cotton, canola, sugar beets. Then there's papaya from Hawaii or China. And there's little zucchini and crookneck squash. There's 9 genetically modified food crops. So I'll tell you now, non-GMOshoppingguide.com. We have damage to the surface of the digestive tract. Okay? The Bt-toxin caused damage to the microvilli in mice. Also, we have the stomach lining. This is the stomach lining of rats that were fed Bt potatoes, causing a dramatic change in the architecture here, as well as the intestinal lining right here. This is not from a particular gene that was inserted. This is from the process, the collateral damage that occurs as a result of the process of genetic engineering, causing dramatic changes to the gut walls that might impair digestion. Then you have leaky gut, which is correlated with food allergies, inflammation, autoimmune disease, and gluten sensitivity. Now, what can cause leaky gut? Can anyone guess? Bt, right. Bt creates holes and leakage in human cells. It's found in the blood, and it might be produced in our own intestinal flora.
GMO stands for genetically modified organism. You will also often hear GE, genetically engineered, or GM, simply genetically modified. Creating GMOs is a laboratory process where a single gene from one organism is forcibly inserted into the DNA of another unrelated species. Species used range from bacteria and viruses to insects and animals, and the combinations bear no resemblance to natural breeding. Side effects of this process are harmful and absolutely unpredictable. Why are GMOs dangerous? GM crops work in a couple of different ways. One variety is herbicide tolerant and designed to survive high doses of toxic weed killers. The other variety produces an insecticide within its cells, which when eaten breaks open the stomachs of insects and kills them. GM toxins can also break holes in the membranes of human cells and enter our bloodstreams. Ever heard of leaky gut? Everyone seems to have it these days. It occurs when the intestinal mucosa is damaged, breaking apart the tight junctions of the cells, creating inflammation and destroying our intestinal barrier. The damaged cells are then not only unable to digest food and produce enzymes, leading to malnutrition, but also allow undigested food particles, toxins, and bacteria to enter the bloodstream, causing immune responses, allergies, and food sensitivities. One of my biggest heroes, Jeffrey Smith, has recently published new research connecting GMOs to gluten sensitivity and the 300 plus gluten-related conditions that demonstrate faster recovery once GMOs are eliminated. I strongly urge you to read his paper linked below, which contains more compelling data and shocking facts. The top 6 GMO crops are corn, soy, cottonseed, sugar beets, canola, and alfalfa. Others include papaya, zucchini, and yellowneck squash. GMOs are in up to 90% of the food in our grocery store, in the form of high fructose corn syrup, oils containing canola, soy, corn, or cottonseed, sugar, unless specified from cane, and less obvious ingredients like aspartame, MSG, starch, whey, citric acid, and so many others. Meat and dairy also contain GMOs due to the fact that most factory farm animals are fed GMO feed. and cows are often shot up with genetically modified bovine growth hormone. Vitamin supplements and enzymes are even produced with ingredients derived from GMOs on most occasions. Try to avoid processed foods as much as possible, unless they are verified organic or labeled with the Non-GMO Project seal. Jeffrey Smith's Institute for Responsible Technology has developed a shopping guide that's perfect to bring with you to the grocery store. It contains GMO-free brands in about every food and body care category. It can be downloaded in the form of a pamphlet or an iPhone app at nongmoshoppingguide.com. I'll include the link below. I like to refer to my personal dietary choices as pure food veganism. I prefer to eat a high raw, high carb, low fat, low oil, low salt, vegan diet. And keep it pure, meaning as organic and GMO free as possible, in order to help those of you making the admirable decision to eliminate GMOs. I will be posting non-GMO grocery store product reviews and dining out options in future videos and on my soon-to-come website, theveganvibe.com. Keep an eye out. How can we join the fight against GMOs? With every dollar you spend on an organic or non-GMO project item, you are contributing to the fight. The more money major food companies lose to non-GMO food brands, the faster they are going to make changes. Education and action is key. Inform your friends and family members. Join local protests like March Against Monsanto or Responsible Technologies Tipping Point Network. Please watch Jeffrey Smith's documentary, Genetic Roulette. You'll gain a deeper understanding of GMOs from the science, to the politics, to the health risks involved. And watch for my membership club, Partners in Purity.
This comes out of the scientific literature. Chronic fatigue. Many people speak to me about chronic fatigue. Take out the dairy, and the problem is very often solved. Tension headaches, musculoskeletal pain, hyperactivity, bedwetting, allergies and congestion. Many allergies can be taken straight back to dairy. Asthma and respiratory difficulties. Early arteriosclerosis from oxidized cholesterol. Now, this is a very important point. Cholesterol itself is not so problematic. Oxidized cholesterol is problematic. And milk is in air and oxidizes very readily, and milk is one of the prime sources of oxidized cholesterol. And you would want to avoid that as much as you can. Juvenile diabetes, we've dealt with in quite some detail. Acne, all the problems associated with trying to get rid of the products you cannot digest come out through the skin. Acne, rheumatoid arthritis is often associated with dairy consumption. And all the nerve disorders like neuralgic diseases, Gehrig's disease, multiple sclerosis, and IQ. There are numerous studies which show that children raised on dairy have a considerably lower IQ than children raised on mother's milk, for example. So with all this listing, why would you want to use dairy products? One reason, and one reason alone, remains. The fat is bad, the protein is indigestible or partly digestible and is bad for you. There's one reason and one reason alone why you would want to use dairy products, and what is that? Calcium.
There's a whole bunch of information about the connection of multiple sclerosis and the cow's milk. Cow's milk is saturated fat. When you're fed a diet that is high in saturated fat, it has to be low in unsaturated fats or essential fats. So you're basically raised on a diet deficient in essential fatty acids. So you can't build a strong nervous system because you don't have the components in your food, like when you're raised on infant formulas or cow's milk as a little baby. So you lay the foundation in your myelin, which are the sheaths that cover your nerves. You lay a poor foundation, a poor structure in there, and then something happens later in life. It could be a virus, could be an autoimmune reaction, could be a circulatory reaction. Something happens. Now, blood cells, they have a negatively charged membrane so that like magnets, when you put the negative poles together, they repel each other. When you eat fat, what happens is the fat coats the cells so that they lose this ability to repel, and so they stick together and clump, they aggregate.
You could watch the circulation slowing down and sometimes stopping for a period.
Blood flow prior to any meal, you see a nice even circulation. There it is in a big blood vessel. That's prior to eating any meal. And then you feed the fat, and the fat coats the cells. And after the fat coats the cells, they can't repel. Instead, they hit, stick, form clumps. This is called rouleau formation. You see the sludging of the blood. This takes place in every capillary in the body. The oxygen tension in the blood drops by 20%. The barrier between the blood and the nervous system is broken down so that things can get into the nervous system that wouldn't otherwise be allowed. Those things are antibodies are allowed to get into the nervous system and attack parts of the nervous system called the myelin. But this happens with many, many other diseases, and these are called villi. You can see them under a microscope. This is the wall of the small intestine. And if you notice, these villi have one cell here coating all these villi. Okay? And then after whatever it is in the gut, the stuff, food, whatever is in the gut, after it goes through this one cell, then it can get into the bloodstream. When you eat, it can determine that the proteins that you eat should be allowed to get into your body to provide for your protein needs. But the proteins you eat, like that are bacteria or viruses, it can tell those are bad proteins and it won't let them into your body. What happens is this, is those cells get injured. They get injured by the foods that we eat. They get injured by the drugs we take. They get injured by viruses. And what happens is a whole layer of these cells will be denuded, will be missing. And so you don't have cells to make this discrimination. And then what happens is substances can leak through into the bloodstream. This is called a leaky gut. One of the more common ways to get a leaky gut is to take non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, Advil, Motrin. You take these kinds of drugs on a regular basis, it can take up to 4 months to grow this barrier back. In other words, to compare those that got the drugs and those that didn't, those that got the drugs did worse. So, the National Health Service said the manufacturers would need to pay the National Health Service to use the drugs. That was the agreement. We'd pay based upon the effectiveness, and the end results are, if we're going to use these drugs in Britain, in England, if we're going to use these drugs based upon the effectiveness, you guys have to pay us to treat the patients because they do more harm than good. It's called the scheme. And these antibodies that it makes against these proteins, they find similar proteins in our body. The process is called molecular mimicry. Mimicry as in copy. They find similar proteins. Like, for example, this antibody attacks a segment on beta-casein, 17 amino acids that we've identified. There are similar proteins that you would find in cells in the pancreas. This is the pancreas. And part of this pancreas is made up of cells called beta cells. And it makes antibodies against this animal thyroid protein. And once it makes its antibodies, it goes around looking for that animal thyroid protein, but in the process it finds human thyroid protein, attacks it, and kills it. Now, where would you get animal thyroid protein? Where do you get that? Hot dogs? Lunch meats? I mean, what are these things made of? This is the waste of the slaughterhouse. They take the tails and the vaginas and the scrotums and the lips and the thyroid glands, and they grind them all up and they put them in these lunch meats and hot dogs. And so you eat these things. And so you eat these foreign thyroids. You know, they're foreign. They're from a pig or a cow. The body recognizes them foreign. It makes antibodies against these proteins. Those same segments of amino acids that are on that foreign protein are also represented on your thyroid. They find these same proteins, in this case, these same 17 amino acids on that pancreas, and they go and they attack that, and they kill the cells. You know, we're dealing with all kinds of problems. There are all kinds of autoimmune diseases, and they work by a similar mechanism, molecular mimicry. There's problems like when it comes to multiple sclerosis, we have a myelin sheath. This is the nerve. There's a sheath, myelin sheath. It's protein. What happens is foreign proteins, cow milk protein. I mean, that's what's been identified in animal studies. Cow milk protein gets through the leaky gut, into the bloodstream. The body makes antibodies to a segment of the cow milk protein. Dr. Swank told you the blood-brain barrier gets damaged, which is the second step that has to take place, possibly through the circulatory changes that take place, the anoxia, the relatively low supply of oxygen occurs when you sludge the blood. So now the blood-brain barrier is damaged. Now these antibodies that are attacking cow milk protein can get through the blood-brain barrier, and they attack the myelin sheath and kill the myelin sheath. And so what happens is you've got this myelin sheath covering this nerve, protecting and allowing conduction, and you end up destroying the cells, the myelin sheath cells, oligodendrocytes, and you end up with a nervous system that doesn't work. These don't grow back. Multiple sclerosis is an autoimmune disease. Everybody knows that. So what induces the autoimmunity? Well, in scientific research, I mean, if you take and you look at type 1 diabetes, which we've done hundreds of studies on, showing that it's caused by cow's milk consumption, you compare all the characteristics, the epidemiology, the geographic distribution, the changes in population, the animal studies, you compare type 1 diabetes to multiple sclerosis, you've got essentially identical disease patterns. Dr. Swank, his job in World War II was to study the disease patterns in Western Europe. As Dr. Deal talked to you a bit last night, what was discovered was when people were under tremendous stress, they were being shot by Nazi Germans and gassed and taken away from their families. I just can't imagine how much stress was going on. They got healthier. Much less heart disease, much less type 1 diabetes, type 2 diabetes, fewer new cases of MS. People who had MS stopped having attacks. People with diabetes stopped having complications. They just, tremendously healthier in this time of great stress. And the reason was, as Dr. Deal told you, is because they had to change their diet. They had to eat, potatoes, and they couldn't eat the butter. They couldn't eat the pork chops. They had to eat the vegetables. So their health flourished. Well, Dr. Swank saw this. He saw it with MS, and they started looking around the world. They found around the world that people ate a starch-based diet, like in Japan, there was no MS. In rural China, there was no MS. In places in Africa where they ate a healthy diet, there was no MS. There was none. He said the Chinese government was able to find 5 cases of MS in the entire country. And he said he doubted, Dr. Swank told me he doubted they were even MS. The multiple sclerosis is rare around the equator. As you move away from the equator to the poles, it becomes common. As you move away from the equator, you change your diet. People who eat in this area of the planet are on starch-based diets. I know that's changing. But traditionally, up until the last few years, they've been living on diets of various grains and potatoes and so on. As you move away from the equator, your diet becomes dairy and meat. That's the problem. Cow is not supposed to be running around in your bloodstream. No limits to starches, vegetables, and fruit. That is the Swank diet. Now this is real important for you to understand this. What Swank did is he published a paper in 1991 in Lancet where he looked at his patients. He looked at his patients that had been studied for 34 years. He looked at their diet and looked at the progression of their disease, and this is what he found. He found that a difference of 8 grams of saturated fat intake daily resulted in a 3-fold increased chance of dying of multiple sclerosis. 8 grams more saturated fat, 3 times more risk of dying of multiple sclerosis. What is 8 grams of saturated fat? If you have 1 sausage a day, that's 10 grams of saturated fat. You increase your risk of dying of multiple sclerosis by 3-fold. You have 1 burger, 3 times the risk of dying of multiple sclerosis. 1 porterhouse steak, 3 times a day, just 1. Oh, let's see, a chicken McNugget, 3 times the risk of dying of multiple sclerosis. A little cheese, 3 times the risk of dying of multiple sclerosis. A little cheesecake, 3 times the risk of dying of multiple sclerosis. No, it's not a lot of this saturated fat you have to eat to change the course of your disease. Or it's not a lot you got to get out of your diet to save your life. Remember, any other treatment, within 10 years, half the people are unable to walk unassisted, wheelchair-bound, bedridden, or dead. I don't care what kind of drug you throw at them. I don't care if you spend $30,000 a year treating them. It doesn't make any difference. They're in huge trouble. So what's Dr. Swank's result? Well, Dr. Swank reports with the Swank diet, relapses decreased by 70% in the first year of treatment. Now, pay attention to this because you're going to hear it again. From 1 relapse per year to 0.2 relapse per year. And he says, then after the first year, there were continued improvements, about 5% fewer relapses per year for the next 2 years. Okay, let's hear what. And he said, for the first 16 years of treatment, a low-fat diet, the rate of exacerbation, new attacks, or decline was decreased by 95%. In other words, in 16 years, actually it continued out for 34 years, if you followed the diet, you had less than a 5% chance of getting worse. This involves 5,000 patients. This involves 34 years of research.
These patients were placed on diet beginning actually in December of 1948. And as I saw patients, they were added through the years. One of the first things we noticed was a marked decrease in the elevation per year per patient. During the first year, there was about a 70% reduction in exacerbations, and in the next 2 years, about 5% each. And we published our first paper along about this time, at which point there was an enormous decrease in the exacerbation rate. We've continued to follow the diet for follow the exacerbation rate for 16 years. Came down to a level which was about a reduction of at least 95%, and stayed down there during the 16 years, and it's continued to be that way. So you have a rapid drop in exacerbation rate, and followed then by a very low level of exacerbations going on for years. Well, what comes from this, as I see it, is that low-fat diet is very helpful. It can control the disease. If you start it early, patients can have a 95% chance of preventing disability from developing in patients over a very long period of time, 34 years, provided they follow the diet carefully. If they go off diet for any period of time, like months or so, the chances are pretty good that they will begin to get into trouble. And if they're off diet for a long time, sometimes that trouble may not come on for as long as 5 years, but then when it does come on, it comes on with a vengeance.
Most people in this country expect to be cured by a pill, and to have a cure that is almost instantaneous. With a low-fat diet, the people actually have to work to get better and have to cure themselves.
The people you see have been diagnosed with ALS, also known as Lou Gehrig's disease or MND. They were only given 2 to 5 years to live.
I had this cramping, and even the fingers started to curl in. These 3 fingers began to curl, and I would have to physically pry it open.
I was struggling to breathe, to swallow, to climb a simple set of stairs, and was losing my ability to speak.
After about 2.5 years of testing, I was diagnosed with ALS. I was told to go home and get my affairs in order.
You have motor neuron disease, which is what we call ALS over here. And I said, and what is motor neuron disease? And I got the textbook reply. And I said, so what's the prognosis? And he said, well, you have about 2 years to live.
He told me I had ALS. He also told me I was going to die.
I refused to accept the prognosis of my pessimistic doctors and dismissed them. I aggressively sought and found alternative therapies.
My approach has been holistic from the beginning.
People with a neurologic dysfunction tend to improve on removing some of the toxic metals from their system that will affect the nervous system.
There are a whole host of brain diseases that are linked to mercury epidemiologically. Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, ALS, MS, autism, and acrodynia are all brain diseases, and that they're all linked to mercury.
I have removed all the toxin from my body.
Make sure the lymph system is open so that as you're mobilizing these toxins from intracellular to extracellular, that the detox pathways are open, that the valves are open, that things are functioning.
People who come to recognize the stresses in their lives and deal with them actually do much better, have much fewer relapses, and that's been documented in the literature.
I'm Alan Scott Douglas.
And I'm Patricia Tomowski. We found people around the world who are doing what is considered impossible, healing from ALS. They are no longer deteriorating and their health is improving.
How can anybody graduate from hospice and still be alive today if they haven't done something really dramatic other than the conventional medical system?
I remember him coming saying, they say I have Lou Gehrig's disease, ALS, and we both made a pact that we would do everything possible to keep him alive, and amazingly he's done that.
My talking improved so much I couldn't believe it.
The fingers, I was able to use them normally by now. We had the wasting.
The turnaround in the illness occurred rapidly for me. And the other people I've spoken to, the long-term survivors, say that suddenly it stopped.
After 2 to 3 months, we had stopped the progression of the disease and started to improve and have done ever since. Today, 2.5 years later, I swim, play golf, and am as active as most 66-year-olds.
And we do have 300,000 data points of chemistry information over the last several decades showing that when the mercury and the root canals and something called cavitations are cleaned up and you balance the chemistry, the body can recover from a lot of these incurable diseases. But people believe that sort of thing, that you take the most toxic element in the world and put it in the mouth and now it is safe. You know these new light bulbs, these corkscrews things that are full of mercury? If you break one of those, somebody sent me the paper the other day of all the things you have to do. First you call Obama, no, that was on something else. Anyway, there are a lot of things that you have to do. And yet there are 500,000 times more mercury than that in one filling. And not to worry. What's going on here? The important thing is it doesn't have to happen. You don't have to have multiple sclerosis. It came out in around 1832 in Paris, France. And the first commercially prepared amalgams were placed, take a guess.
At the same time.
Same time, same place, 1832 in Paris, France. Is there a relationship? Leukemia kind of came in at the same time. Is there a relationship? No, these things are coincidental. Well, there are hundreds of coincidences of people who are in perfectly good health. They get a root canal placed, they get a bunch of amalgams placed, their health goes down the tubes.
Dr. Roy Swank, who we lost at age 99, was a distinguished neurologist whose research culminated in over 170 scientific papers. Let's look at a few. As far back as 1950, we knew that there were areas in the world that had a lot of MS, North America, Europe, and other places, Africa and Asia, that hardly had any. And now we have all these migration studies showing that if you move from a high-risk area to a low-risk area, your risk drops, and vice versa. So it seemed less genetics and more lifestyle. Dr. Swank had an idea, as he recounted in an interview with Dr. John McDougall at the ripe young age of 84.
It seemed possible to me that this could be a matter of food, because the further north you go, the less vegetarian life is led, and the more people are carnivores, you might say. They spend a lot more time eating meat.
After looking at the multiple sclerosis data from World War II in occupied countries where meat and dairy were rationed, and his famous study in '52 finding the frequency of MS directly related to the amount of saturated animal fat consumed daily in different areas of Norway, he concluded it might be the animal fat, so he decided to put it to the test by restricting people's intake of saturated animal fat. Here's his first 47 patients, before cutting out about 90% of the saturated fat from their diet, and here's after, showing a decrease in both the frequency and severity of MS attacks. Normally you're lucky if you get people to stick to a diet for 6 months, and so that's why most dietary trials last a year at the most. This is reporting results from the first 3.5 years. Then came the 5.5-year follow-up. he adds another 100 patients. Then the 7-year follow-up, published in the Annals of Internal Medicine. Then the 20-year follow-up, the 34-year follow-up. How did they do? If you can get people early in their disease, when they're only mildly disabled, and restrict their saturated fat intake, Dr. Swank showed he could stop their disease in 95% of cases. No further disability 34 years later. But if they started slacking on their diet even years in, their disease could become reactivated. It felt so great, they were like, hey, I can cheat a little bit, I got this disease under control. But eating just 8 grams of saturated fat more a day was accompanied by a striking increase in disability and nearly tripling the death rate. How about a 50-year follow-up? They were able to track down 15 of the original patients that stuck to the diet, now in their 70s and 80s, with multiple sclerosis for over 50 years. And 13 out of 15 were walking around normal in all respects. They were active and evidently unusually youthful looking. Conclusion: this study indicated that in all probability, MS is caused largely by consumption of saturated animal fat. He thought it was the sludging of the blood caused by even a single meal of saturated fats that can clog tiny capillaries that feed our nervous system. See, diets rich in saturated fat and cholesterol can thicken the blood and make our red cells sticky. A single meal of sausage and eggs can stick our blood cells together like rolls of quarters. And this kind of hyperaggregation can lead to a reduction in blood flow and oxygenation of our tissues. If you put someone's blood through a machine that sucks out about 90% of the cholesterol in their blood, you can demonstrate an immediate improvement in microcirculation in the heart muscle. But what about the brain? Eyes are the windows to your brain. You can visualize in real time changes in blood vessel function in the retina at the back of the eye, which gives you a sense of what's happening further back in the brain. And if you lower the cholesterol level in the blood, you can immediately get a significant improvement in vasodilation. The little veins open wider and let the blood flow. So yes, it could be the saturated fat leading to clogging of our capillaries, but now we know animal fats can have all sorts of other deleterious effects, such as inflammation, so who knows what the actual mechanism may be by which cutting animal fat can cut MS progression. Regardless, patients with MS that follow a diet with no more than 10 or 15 grams of saturated fat can expect to survive and thrive to a ripe old age. Of course, cutting out saturated fat completely might be better, given that heart disease is our #1 killer. The bottom line is that the results Dr. Swank published remain the most effective treatment of multiple sclerosis ever reported in the peer-reviewed medical literature. In patients with early-stage MS, 95% were without progression of their disease 34 years later after adopting his low-saturated fat dietary program. Even patients with initially advanced disease showed significant benefit. To date, no medication or invasive procedure has ever even come close to demonstrating such success. Doesn't cost $30,000, doesn't give you leukemia, and works better. Of course, this all begs one big obvious question. If Dr. Swank's results are so stunningly impressive, why haven't other physicians, neurologists, or centers adopted this method of treatment? Good question. One reason may be that MRI machines weren't invented until the 1970s. MRIs are how we track the progress of MS today. We don't have to rely on patients' subjective reports or doctors' clinical judgments. We can see the disease get better or worse right there in black and white. It's like in the 1970s when Nathan Pritikin appeared to reverse heart disease by the thousands, but no one took him seriously until angiography was invented, and the likes of Ornish and Esselstyn could hold up images like this, proving conclusively that a plant-based diet could literally open up arteries right there in black and white. So what we need is someone to repeat Swank's experiments today with MRI scans every step of the way, and I'm happy to report that exact experiment was just completed. by Dr. John McDougall. Dr. Swank was one of Dr. McDougall's medical mentors, and Dr. McDougall is one of mine. Study enrollment was completed last year, and we should have the results sometime soon.
I began noticing that I was having trouble speaking and walking, and I knew this probably was linked to motor neuron disease. And when I finally got tested, I was in fact diagnosed at the University of California at San Francisco at the ALS clinic with ALS, Amyotrophic Lateral Sclerosis, or Lou Gehrig's disease. It is the degeneration of the motor neurons. It's a terrible diagnosis. My EMG, or muscular testing, showed atrophy of the muscles on the left side, atrophy of the tongue. I couldn't say a full sentence in late June without stumbling over words. Also, I was given a swallow test because my tongue was atrophied, and it showed that I was not pushing food down my throat. I couldn't swallow a pill, and I'm on a liquid diet, which helps it. But they wanted to put a feeding tube in me immediately. And the reason they do that is because your muscles atrophy so fast that if they wait to do it when you can't swallow at all, then it's often too late. So now the procedure, the treatment, is to put in a feeding tube. I declined that and said I wanted to try Dr. Young's treatment. Then they gave me a lung test, lung function test, and my lung function was 56% of normal capacity. And they wanted to fit me with a breathing mask and then have a breathing tube done eventually. By the way, 50% lung capacity, you have 1 year life expectancy, so that wasn't good. But I didn't use the breathing mask or breathing tube. I didn't want that yet. And I wanted to try Dr. Young's treatment. I tried to figure out, how did I get sick? I was doing the program moderately, but I had tremendous emotional stress. I know that made me vulnerable. I feel like that more than anything. I wasn't so physically stressed as I was emotionally stressed. So I think that is the etiology of the ALS. Although I think I kept a moderate level pH, a fairly good pH, but maybe I needed to be at 8 and above to counteract the stresses that were on me. That's how I understand it now. So here I am at the center, and I am, in fact, my own case study now. And I'm watching myself very carefully and documenting everything that happens. I'm also making sure that it's recorded what other patients are doing, and I'm seeing wonderful changes in all of us. Every morning we go through a rigorous exercise or vigorous exercise program, which I never thought I could do before I got ill. And I'm following along pretty well now. We are eating only green and leafy vegetables, and I'm doing just the liquid and pureed versions because I'm trying to take the burden off my system of digestion. At any rate, there's a whole program. It's 24/7. You are working on healing yourself all day and sleeping to heal as well. And there's little time for anything else. But it's not chemotherapy. It's not painful. It's just challenging. And I'm very blessed to be here, because if I wasn't here, I'd have tubes coming in and out of me, and by now I'd be in a wheelchair. But instead, what the hypothesis is that I want to see tested and thoroughly tested is that in my case, I have motor neuron death. So the hypothesis is if I alkalinize my system, then that will stop the motor neuron death. And when I arrived, it was high. I could feel it in the fasciculations, they call them. They're twitches or flinches in your muscles. It's the motor neurons dying. It went from high, which was wild. It was, my body was just going, twitching all the time, to medium, and now a month here, very low. I feel a little bit. It's very reassuring. I want it to stop entirely, but it may take several months of alkalinizing my system to stop it. That's the hypothesis. And the other thing we're doing at the same time, which I think is extremely important for ALS people, but everyone, is that there's an intensive program of exercise. I spend an hour every morning, often with Dr. Young leading the Younger Yoga, where we do kind of calisthenics and yoga. And I feel like that is the most important part of my healing, because I have to build the motor neurons that are dying. I have to replace the motor neurons. I walk up and down the hills probably a mile every day. So there's one half of stopping the motor neuron death, stopping it and building new motor neurons. That's how I'm thinking about it. Research may tell us that other things are happening, but I want to see it studied, because I am far better today than I was when I came.
Diet high in carotenoids from fruits and vegetables may help prevent or delay the onset of ALS. Sunday, March 3, 2013 by John Phillip. Amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, better known as ALS, is a devastating degenerative illness that incapacitates its victims in a manner similar to those suffering from Alzheimer's disease. At present, there is no known cure or effective treatment for the illness, which is believed to be the result of oxidative stress caused by decades of poor diet, stress, environmental toxins, and poor physical conditioning. Researchers have now discovered that increased consumption of foods containing colorful carotenoids, particularly beta-carotene and lutein, may prevent or delay the onset of ALS. ALS, or Lou Gehrig's disease, is a progressive neurological disease that attacks nerve cells in the brain and spinal cord known to be responsible for the control of voluntary muscles. As the motor neurons degenerate, the muscles they control gradually weaken and waste away, leading to paralysis. A research team from the Harvard School of Public Health has published the results of their research in the Annals of Neurology, that builds on prior studies showing that carotenoids, the natural compounds that give fruits and vegetables their bright orange, red, or yellow colors, provide critical antioxidant support to help fight this devastating disease. Natural sources of fruits and dark, leafy vegetables help lower risk of developing ALS. Scientists evaluated 5 large studies comprising more than 1 million participants to develop a basis for evaluation. Researchers reviewed food intake for the group and further broke consumption down to determine carotenoids eaten in the form of fruits and vegetables. Lead study author Dr. Alberto Escurio noted, understanding the impact of food consumption on ALS development is important. Our study is one of the largest to date to examine the role of dietary antioxidants in preventing ALS. A total of 1,093 cases of ALS were identified across the cohort of subjects. The team found that those with the highest intake of carotenoids from any source had the lowest risk of developing ALS. They also determined that individuals who consumed more carotenoids in their diets were more likely to exercise, have an advanced degree, have higher vitamin C consumption, and take vitamin C and E supplements. Participants with the highest dietary consumption of beta-carotene and lutein, most commonly found in dark green vegetables, had a reduced risk of developing ALS. Interestingly, the researchers found that diets high in lycopene, beta-cryptoxantin, and vitamin C did not reduce disease incidence, and long-term vitamin C supplement intake was also not associated with lower ALS risk. Dr. Escurio concluded our findings suggest that consuming carotenoid-rich foods may help prevent or delay the onset of ALS. This study acts to support a large volume of prior works that reinforce the critical importance of a natural food diet consisting largely of fruits and vegetables to thwart diseases ranging from cancer and diabetes to Alzheimer's disease and ALS.